Welcome to another Basar B'chalav class. We are continuing in the laws of Basar B'chalav here in Siman Sadi Aleph. We are now in Seif Gimel. We've been talking about rules of where meat and milk have mixed together, and we've been discussing primarily cold interactions, cold mixtures. And we talked about when they are touching each other, and now we're going to talk about when they touch some bread. So we've discussed in a previous chapter in Siman Pei Tes, we discussed over there about not having the bread share the table. So let's talk about what actually happens when there is actual contact and not just theoretical contact. So we're moving forward here. We're in Siman Sadi Aleph. Chapter 91, we are in Seif Gimel, we are in halacha number 3. So it says, Tzarich lehi zoher shelo yiga basar b'lechem. The Shulchan Aruch says that one should be very careful that the meat not touch the bread. She'im yigabo asar la'achlo im gvina, because if it does touch it, you could not eat it with cheese. V'cheni zoher shelo yiga bo gvina she'im yigabo asar la'achlo im basar. And conversely, he doesn't say conversely, but this is what it means. And similarly, is how the words actually means. One should be cautious to not let the cheese touch the bread, because if the cheese touches the bread, it would be prohibited to eat it with meat. So what does this halacha mean? Does that mean that like I could never do it, or it just means that does the bread become a piece of isser itself? What does this all mean? So this is not a very intense section, but it's still an important halacha to learn. So is it permitted to eat a certain bread with meat and cheese if it had come in contact with meat, to then eat it with cheese, and then conversely, if it came in contact with cheese, then eat it with meat? Is there a way to permit that? So the Gemara in Chulin, it says the following. It says, Ein lashin esa isa b'chalav. Okay. It says v'im lash kolapas kula asura mipnei hergel avera. So there's a prohibition. It's not only mentioned in Chulin; it's also repeated in Pesachim, and it's repeated in a few places. So you're not allowed to knead your dough with milk. And if you do, then the bread becomes prohibited because of the accustomment to, or becoming accustomed to do something inappropriate. Those are what the words mean. Okay. So Rashi explains, okay? So it's prohibited all year long, okay? This is what the hergel avera is. So that way you don't eat it with meat. So there is a prohibition to eat bread that was mixed with milk, to have it with meat, okay? Or to even smear some of the fat from it onto it, and vice versa, okay? You can't have it at all. Not because you would eat it together with meat, but because there might come a point where you would actually consume it with the other thing. So that's the concern. It's not it itself becomes prohibited because it might get mixed with something else. Okay, so that's one prohibition. Okay, that we don't really. That's not this here is not really its main spot. Here is really talking about if it touches it with bread, or that touches the bread with the meat or with the cheese. So if you eat it with dairy products, so is this the same thing as mixing it with it? So mixing it, I understand. There's milk in it, and there's a problem. What if it just touched it on the table? So the Pri Megadim asks this question because really the Iker spot of this is in Sadi Zion, okay, in 97, where we say you this is where we bring the halacha where you can't knead the dough with milk because you might eat it with meat, okay, and we have some leniencies over there. So if you did mix it with milk, if it's something that's small that can be eaten in one shot, like a croissant, right, which is kneaded with butter, or a donut, right, which is made with milk, and it's only made for that day, okay, or it looks completely different, like a croissant or like a donut, okay. Those are all different ways to permit that. Or it looks like, or you like to talk about with English muffins as an example. They're English muffins. They now make many pareve English muffins. So according to Pri Megadim, when meat touches the bread, you can't eat it even with other meat. That's what this halacha is teaching, and what we would infer from that statement over there. And so too, you can't eat it, okay, unless it's been rinsed off or scraped off. So when you know that it's touched it. So if you don't know, then that would imply that, for example, if you just take bread off of the Shabbos table where you ate meat, but you didn't see it touch it. So we learned in last week's shir that it would be entirely possible to simply scrape the bread, or we saw also from the Mishnah Berurah that if it's not asur min adin, meaning you didn't see them touch each other, b'diavad, it would be okay if you made something or had it come in contact with something dairy or made it into something dairy. Okay? So the Pri Megadim takes an approach that you can rinse the bread, and the assumption is that I could somehow rinse it off and get the meat or the cheese off of it. So meaning he's not saying that you will both forget to rinse it, which we talked about at the beginning of this siman, okay, about forgetting to rinse off the meat that comes in contact with the dirty kalim, and also that you'll eat it with cheese. So that's why he's saying that it seems to be plausible. And this is echoing the statement of a shach that says this at the end of Tzadi Vav. All right, this is 96:23 in the shach. So that's where this statement would basically come from. So if you kind of put all these together, that would be the implication of this halacha. Okay, Darchei Tshuva quotes the Yad Yehuda, who himself discusses the Pri Megadim. So he's saying that you didn't really take that much off of the bread. So you kind of like scrape it with a knife or scrape it with a fork. You scrape off like the outer surface of it, or you rinse it off with some water. Okay, and he says so those type of breads would be the same as being mixed with milk. But if you did a full klipa, okay, so it doesn't go in that far, then the rest of the bread should be fine. So if it's a small piece of bread and that came in touch with it, and you can eat it in one meal, then that would be permitted based on the rules brought down in Sadi Zayin. And if you were intending to keep it dairy anyway, right? Let's say you made challah, like a big challah, and you ate it with a dairy meal, and you're going to keep it dairy into the next meal, and you're going to use it for like French toast, so then that would also be acceptable, okay? Because then you're not going to forget, because you know you're only going to use it for dairy. So those are some additional leniencies added on there, because the concern is an oopsie, I'll forget type of thing. Okay? And so, but the one way in which he differentiates from the Pri Megadim is he's like, well, you really need to eat it immediately. So if you're gonna put some cream cheese on it and eat it, do that now. Okay? And don't like hold off on it. Don't make a cheese sandwich, leave it in the fridge for later, or so on. Okay? So other people point out that you don't actually have to cut the slice off. That's why scraping the front surface will be fine. So that's brought down the Marasham. And the Aruch Shulchan echoes that as well, that maybe there's something different between, being baked with milk mixed into the dough versus being baked like pareve bread and then it absorbs some milk. So even there, we could even argue that there was no gezerah in that case. Okay. From the Chidah and Rav Pa'alim, he quotes another tshuva from the Shalom Meshiv, where he says that if you know that it touched but you didn't intentionally put them one on the other, if you're going to eat it right now, that would be fine. Okay? However, if you want to keep it around, then you have to actually put something dairy on it to demarcate it as dairy. So that's his heter for that. Similarly, that's what some people allowed for. That was some people who permitted bread, slices of bread, to be sold at a supermarket with a dairy hechsher, meaning it'd be like whatever the hechsher is, dairy bread slices, because it's marked dairy. Okay, but the Chachmas Adam, he says, I don't think so. But if it's a big loss, like that you could be lenient if you make a mark on it saying that it's dairy somehow. Okay, or you pass out the pieces to a lot of different people, as long as it's not going to sit around and do that. The Madnei Shulchan adds another differentiating level, quoting the Aruch. He's dealing with the statement of the Aruch Shulchan that we just quoted. So being mixed with milk is where the Gemara says that it should be prohibited. Okay, and if you were to take that and cook it with meat, there's an Isser Torah that applies over there. So that's why they didn't even allow you to eat it with it, because of the extension of you should forget. However, if it's just touching, that's not an extension of the Torah prohibition. And so therefore you could eat it by itself and not worry about it. Okay? So he says that's why it has to be something that touches and comes in contact with it. That's what prohibits it. So if it's being eaten on its own or with the same thing that touched it, that should be permitted. And that seems to be the standard opinion and the best explanation of it. Let's just talk about the ways in which we could fix the bread. So we talked about rinsing it off. Does that actually work? As many of you might notice, that when you put water to bread, it kind of gets absorbed into it. What are we talking about? So a number of Achrayim asked a simple question about rinsing off the bread. They don't understand why that would permit you to go ahead and eat it with the other type. So if it was on a meat table and came in contact with meat, to rinse it and then eat it with some cheese doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's a big list: the Pri Chadash, the Kresi Uplesi, the Chavis Das, the Chachmas Adam. None of them like that. Okay. And in the Pischei Tshuva, he says that if it touches the hard surface of it, then you could rinse that off. But that shouldn't seem to work if it touched the part where you cut it and it's now exposed the soft part of it. The Knesset Gadola writes on the tour that there is no way to permit it using rinsing. It has to actually be cut off. And the Shach seems to disagree with that statement. So the Shach over here on Sif Katan Beis, he seems to say that no, it should actually work. Okay, so there's a machlokas between the Shach and this Knesset Gadola is to whether or not you could use water to wash it off, or if you have to actually cut off a slice. And the Kaf HaChaim and the Aruch HaShulchan, they seem to say that you're better off just cutting off that little slice, and then the rest of the meat should be fine. Okay, so that's what it seems to be. There's the Pri Megadim over here in the Mishvazot Zahav on the Taz, that there are two concerns, which is that you might eat the meat-touched bread with cheese, and you also might forget to rinse it, which would be consistent with the first halacha. However, if you say that there's no way to clean it off, then maybe that would make sense. And so therefore, the Pri Megadim writes that the proper explanation of the Shulchan Aruch, which comes from the Torah, is really actually to say that that things that really need to be rinsed off, which we quoted from the Bala Itter back on Sif Aleph, things that need to be rinsed off, you can't go ahead and put it on in that situation, lechatchila, to permit it to be used in that case. Okay? And that's why he didn't write this halacha right after Sif Aleph. So, because it's more similar to the case of Sif Beis, which is that the hadacha probably could work, okay, and that's why you might forget, and that's why it's difficult to permit it, okay. So, and even though hadacha doesn't work, scraping the surface would be in place of it, okay, and because we find that in another place, he says, when you slice kishuin, cucumbers. Rinsing it makes it worse, so scraping it is the way to do it. So that's what he recommends. And he also points out that there's a difference between touching the hard outer surface and the softer inside where it can get absorbed more. So how does the Mechaber hold? So he says that it's prohibited if it touches it. So what does that mean? So the Shach, here we saw, which is in Sif Katan Daled, he says that you didn't rinse it off, okay? And that's the problem. If you rinse it off, then it's fine to eat it, just like we would have said at the beginning, okay? And also, one of them has to be wet. So the bread is dry, so then the cheese has to be wet, or the meat has to be wet, okay? So that's also what this Pischei Tshuva brings down, okay? That says that if you're not sure that you're going to eat it with cheese or not, you should be concerned about that. So that's why we brought down all those heterim of saying that if you're going to eat it now, or a lot of people will eat it, and so on. That's the case. So basically that seems to be the understanding of the shach in the mechaber. Okay. However, the Knesset Gedolah would disagree, so it's entirely possible that by Sfardim they should be more stringent, unless they take the approach of the Rav Pa'alim that we mentioned, which is to basically say that if you're going to eat it now and give it to a lot of different people, or if it was by accident, those would be okay. He also brings down that you can also make a heker, right? No, I'm sorry. He says he doesn't bring it down, but it might actually make sense, even according to him. He says you have to put cheese on it to make the heker, right? So he says you have to put cheese on it to demarcate it. So in those cases, even by Sfardim, that would be permitted. Okay. So what did we learn today? We learned a lot of stuff. Basically, you can't eat bread that is mixed with milk. You can't do that. Okay. There are some exceptions that we will go over in Siman Sadi Zion. For example, if it's small, or if it's meant to be eaten right now, or it's going to be broken up to several people. Okay, but you can't keep it around because you might eat it with meat. Okay, and you can't even keep it around to eat it with other dairy. That's what we mean. So if you mix it with milk and you want to have it just to have with dairy foods, you can't do that. Okay. Now, if you had it touch, okay, it was parve bread and it touches dairy. Okay, so are those dinim the same? And the Prima Ganim we saw basically says that it's not the same. It's similar to the case of, or at the very least, it should be the same as Sadi Zion, where if you did mix it, there are all these permissions that you can rely on, right? It's a small amount. It's going to be eaten today. Not keeping it around. It looks different. Okay, so that's different. Yeah, but he does say that you can't keep it around unless you clean off one type with the other. Again, you had to see it touch each other. If you weren't sure and we were just on the table with that stuff, but you didn't see it touch, b'diavad, it would be okay to use, but you really should kasher it. Here, when it actually touches it, you're going to have a separate problem. Where b'diavad, it goes back to the machlokas about what if you osher it a little bit, if it's eaten hot, eaten cold. So those would be that would be the issues discussed in our previous shir, which is that if you're not sure if it touched it, then if you don't do these things, then b'diavad it would be permitted. We saw that from the Mishnah Berurah from last week's class. So Madanei Shulchan said that if you're using parve bread to begin with and it's just touching something else, then you can go ahead and permit it for all time, as long as you scrape the surface, and maybe it's on the outside, to rinse it off. All right, why? Because many poskim are not sure if rinsing it suffices for the spot where you cut it, and that could be a problem. And what we also mentioned last time, which I didn't mention this time, but now that we're kind of going over the halacha, if you cut it with a knife, if the knife was clean, then you wouldn't have this problem, even though you're not supposed to do that. If the knife was dirty, if it was dirty from dairy, then the bread gets treated like something that touched dairy, and if it touched the knife was used for meat and it was still wet and it touches this, cuts it, and it's now considered for meat, and then you would need to either cut off a little bit of slice on that edge over there or scrape it off. One of those two things would be permitted, and then you could go ahead and use the bread for either one afterwards, as long as they take care of that one spot. Okay, so that's the deal. So you could go, if you know that the bread never touched meat, even though it was sat on a meat table, you can go ahead and eat it with cheese afterwards. But some people are still strict not to do that. Okay, so but that's the deal with that. Now, if you went ahead and rinsed it off, so that's what we just said too. That would go ahead and permit it, and that's the best suggestion. Okay. So that's the halachas that we learned from the bread. We still have another sif over here, which is talking about if they touch each other where the bottom one is hot. This is a really important din known as tata gavar. We will visit that in our next class. Thank you very much for joining us. We will talk to you next time.